Deranged killers whose scarily bent minds send them on a mission to murder.
The voices told him that it was God's plan, that people had to be sacrificed.
From whom no one is safe.
He said he was going to go door to door like the Avon lady. He said, "Ding dong, you're dead."
I found a used yogurt cup, and he had been drinking the blood in that cup.
Forensic psychologist Lou Schlesinger has spent decades delving into the minds of serial killers.
The types of murders that we're talking about are extraordinary murders. Motive, method, opportunity, that goes out the window.
Serving detective Jackie Sabir is an expert in the mechanics of murder.
These crimes are opportunistic, so there's no way to get ahead of the game. You're going to start wondering who's next.
Between them, they're analysing one of history's most disturbed killers.
He was like a dead man walking. There was no emotion, there was nothing.
He sent me a note saying, "I want you to get me into the Chamber of Horrors."
And investigating if its perpetrator was born to join this most bizarre of clubs. With over 20 years' experience in homicide, Detective Jackie Sabir has worked on some of Britain's most high-profile murder investigations. She's travelled northwest of London to analyse a disturbing historic case, starting at the former site of an unlikely series of crimes carried out over 40 years ago.
So Bovingdon is a small village in Hertfordshire. It's incredibly developed now, there's a lot of new housing being built. But in the 1970s, apart from a few pubs and the village shop, the major source of employment here was Hadland's factory.
The business carried on there was the making of high-speed lenses for cameras.
It was a great community of people. We all got on very well, certainly all on first name terms. Just a great environment.
But in 1971, all was not well at the lab. Former crime scenes officer Mick Grinstead recalls a summer of sickness for the photographic employees.
What was actually going on at the factory?
Stomach bugs, nausea, all that sort of stuff, and people going all sick.
Anthony Oddams was working in the factory at the time.
You had people who were being violently ill, but it seemed to be repeated several times, and it was clearly very, very unpleasant for them.
It was called in those days the Bovingdon bug.
The onset of the mystery illness had coincided with the arrival of a new storeroom assistant, 23-year-old Graham Young.
He was extremely articulate, and for somebody who was coming in to do what was a supposedly simple job, it was just a bit unusual. I would say Graham was quite a loner. I don't remember him fitting into the other groups particularly.
Although viewed as solitary by his colleagues, trainee Graham Young was always keen to get involved during the factory's breaks.
They used to have a tea trolley lady who used to come round, and Graham would sort of hover and, "Oh, here's your tea."
Storeroom manager Bob Eagle gratefully accepted his trainee's hospitality. But in June 1971, Bob was seemingly struck down by the Bovingdon bug.
Stomach cramps, vomiting. He came back and forth from work a few times, but eventually was hospitalised.
Bob Eagle's condition gradually deteriorated. Inexplicably, paralysis spread through his body, and on the 7th of July, he died of a pneumonia-related illness.
When you're dealing with the employees, did you get any sense of what they were feeling?
They were very shocked because they didn't know what was going on.
In the wake of the storeman's death, his assistant, Graham Young, appeared particularly concerned.
The managing director decided that Young had been so close to Bob that he should represent the firm with him at the funeral.
Despite being a shoulder to cry on, the young storeman was anything but stable. Born in 1947, Graham Young was the second child of Fred and Margaret Young. Detective Jackie Sabir is in his childhood neighbourhood in northwest London, retracing a difficult start to life.
Tragically, his mother died when he was about 3 months old. And unable to cope with two very young children, Graham's father split his children up, and the young Graham spent his very early years with his Aunt Winifred.
Journalist Anthony Holden has extensively studied Graham Young's early years.
How did he get on with his aunt?
Well, he loved his aunt and her husband and their daughter. He was still very small, but I think he was very happy there, and his father used to visit at weekends.
But aged just 3, Graham Young would once again live with his father and a new stepmother.
So his stepmother Molly, what was her relationship like with the very young Graham?
I think it was pretty tense. She did a few things that upset him. For some reason, she destroyed his model plane set. She became the classic wicked stepmother to Graham, I think.
Alongside an unsettled home life, Graham Young began to develop unusual behaviour as he progressed through his early years.
As he grew, he was clearly very intense, a bit of a loner, kept himself to himself, didn't really converse, and would stick in his own room doing things of his own choosing.
Still in his primary school years, Graham Young obsessively collected books on crime. Professor Lou Schlesinger is an expert at analysing the human mind. For him, Graham Young's abnormal childhood behaviour displays clear signs.
If you had to put a diagnostic label on Young, 2 traits come to mind: schizoid and obsessive. Schizoid personality is an individual who is withdrawn from other people. An obsessive individual is someone who's very meticulous and neat and detailed. You don't develop a schizoid personality because of events that happen to you. That's just how your personality is.
Some of history's most unpredictable killers suffered from mental issues in their formative years. In and out of psychiatric institutions from the age of 12, Londoner Patrick Mackay displayed unusual behaviour from an early age.
After school, we used to go exploring. He picked a bell-shaped flower, filled it up with his urine and drunk it in front of me, which I was absolutely gobsmacked, when he did that.
As a young adult, Nazi-obsessed Mackay would be driven to a mission of murder from whom no one was safe.
The priest had been found dead in a bath filled with blood.
This was a frenzied attack with a medieval weapon that caused horrific injuries and wounds.
He said that in the days leading up to a murder, he felt peculiar.
In Maryland, mentally unstable Haddon Clark's childhood was complicated by the disruptive views of a domineering father.
In his case, his father told him quite directly that he didn't want a son, he wanted a daughter.
He was caught dressing in his mother's clothing.
A neighbor came home and walked in his house and found Haddon dressed in his wife's clothing. And Haddon, of course, ran out of the house wearing these clothes, all upset.
In later life, diagnosed schizophrenic Haddon Clark would continue to wear women's clothes. But tragically, his delusional thoughts would lead to his cross-dressing being associated with death.
Most transvestites don't hurt anybody. They're basically harmless people. But Haddon Clark was a very mentally ill person. He eventually went on to kill women and then dress in their clothes. A very unusual case.
In 1958, in Neasden, London, socially awkward Graham Young's strained relationship with his stepmother continued. But outside the family home, the teenager had had some success.
So having passed his 11+ examination, he came to secondary school. What type of pupil was he when he was here? Was he a sociable child?
He had a few friends, some of whom regretted becoming his friends.
Clive Krieger was one of the few who was close to Graham Young. As a fellow pupil, he sat next to him in class.
Well, he was intelligent enough, so I quite liked communicating with him. But he had this association with really negative stuff. One of the things he liked doing was to play a pencil game drawing with gallows. And he would do it with me to try and get me hanging. That was his sort of attitude.
Other school children would pick up on this darker side of Graham Young's personality.
He was always set apart and a bit strange, rabbiting on about pet topics like Hitler and Nazism.
I am Jewish, and he would know that. I don't know whether he genuinely was supporting Hitler, but he deliberately sometimes combed his hair that way just to pee me off.
The eccentric Graham Young didn't shine academically, but he gained notoriety for one subject.
Graham was interested in chemistry. As it happens, so was I. So we were able to communicate and talk about stuff like that.
But the standout pupil's interest in the subject wasn't confined to the classroom. He started sourcing chemicals and toxins to satisfy a morbid curiosity.
He had a small mouse which he had in a large matchbox. He came to my house. He wanted to demonstrate how some of the toxins work. And we'd acquired a syringe from somewhere. And he injected the mouse and it died. He was working out, I think, dosages. He was studying those factors. And I think he was experimenting.
And soon, it wouldn't just be animals suffering at the hand of Graham Young. Forensic psychologist Lou Schlesinger and serving detective Jackie Sabir are investigating the historic case of one of the UK's most disturbed killers. In 1961, in Neasden, London, 13-year-old oddball chemistry genius Graham Young had started experimenting on small animals. But in the spring of that year, his subject matter took on an altogether different form.
There was a boy called Chris Williams who was one of his very few friends. At one point, Williams went off formed a friendship with another schoolboy that Graham was jealous of. They actually had a fist fight that they challenged each other to.
The two school friends made up, but then, out of the blue, Chris Williams fell ill.
Chris would have been sick or had stomach or diarrhea problems for a day, and Graham was amused by that.
Doctors put it down to gastroenteritis, but the reality was very different. Although barely a teenager, Graham Young was purchasing a rare chemical and poisoning his friend.
Was it established what poison Graham was actually using?
He'd managed to buy, unbelievably, from the local chemist, a rare poison called antimony potassium tartrate. He was only 13.
It's not so easy to buy a toxic substance, but he just persuaded them that he was doing experiments with them and they got it for him. He ordered it through there.
With a constant supply, Graham Young kept poison close to him at all times.
He was carrying at that time small bottles, vials, with antimony toxin in his top pocket. He called it his friend.
As he slipped the antimony into Chris Williams' sandwiches, Graham Young confided in his friend Clive Krieger.
Graham told me about it after he'd done it. He was interested in having somebody, in that case it was me, know what was happening. I don't think he did it because he didn't like Chris. I think he was just experimenting.
Although his friend was forced to take time off school, Graham Young found new ways to administer his poisonous antimony.
He and Graham went on a day trip together to London Zoo, where Graham said, "Oh look, I've got something that'll make you feel better," and gave him a bottle of lemonade, which of course had him back in hospital before you knew it.
I don't think he was planning to kill him. I think it was just amusing for Graham to do what he did.
Despite being a close friend, at school lunchtime, Clive Krieger kept his distance from Graham Young.
I was concerned about it, which is why I was very careful about not eating or drinking anything that was anywhere near him. Very important.
Detective Jackie Sabir is meeting up with Professor of Toxicology Rob Chilcott to understand more about teenage Graham Young's sinister use of poison.
Graham Young used antimony salt, which is a salt which readily dissolves in water. It's been described as being slightly sweet and metallic, but if you were to mix that in with food or drink with a stronger flavour, you'd soon not notice that in your food and beverage.
So the amount within the vial there, what would that actually do to somebody?
That would be more than sufficient to cause profuse vomiting, probably within a matter of minutes.
Graham Young is known to have taken detailed notes, observing his friend's physical reactions.
What Graham Young was doing was establishing a dose-response relationship. This is where you slowly increase the dose and see how that affects the outcome.
During the course of 1961, Graham Young was struggling to observe his poison victim, Chris Williams. As his spells off sick became more frequent, Young's new targets would be close to him at all times.
A series of illnesses started happening inside his family. He had slightly frosty relations with his father, but his sister he was perfectly friendly with, but that made no difference to him at all. It's just a total lack of any moral sense.
But Graham Young's main guinea pig was a family member whom he had resented since early childhood.
He told me he didn't like his stepmother. Basically, he was having problems with her and he didn't like the way she treated him. And he was giving her antimony.
One Easter Saturday, Fred got home to find his wife writhing in agony in the garden, throwing up on the floor, and noticed that Graham was just standing at the window watching this objectively rather than offering to help.
He would do graphs of giving drugs to his stepmother and her sickness. He kept her ill off and on and was working on the dosage to do that.
Young precisely administered his poison over the course of a year.
The truth was that Graham had been experimenting, not just with cups of tea. He also put dosages into the Sunday lunch.
I did try and tell a few adults, but they just thought I was a stupid kid.
In April 1962, Graham Young's stepmother, Molly, lost her life. Although doctors were unable to trace her stepson's poison, 14-year-old Graham Young went to extraordinary lengths to cover his tracks.
Following Molly's death, what happened? Was she buried? Was she interred?
Graham, already displaying a lot of expertise, persuaded his father it was much better these days to cremate her. And then, of course, he went to the funeral and literally watched the evidence of his crime go up in smoke.
But as Graham Young's family continued to show signs of ill health, the eccentric pupil's unusual questioning during chemistry classes started to raise suspicions.
Graham consistently would ask the science teacher about subjects related to lead poisoning and things like that. I can still remember the science teacher having a strange look in his eye. You know, he was concerned.
The discovery of poison in Young's school desk would ultimately bring him to justice.
The psychiatrist was brought in to talk to him, and Graham talked with such expertise and arrogance about chemistry and eventually poisons that the psychiatrist called the alarm.
As police raided Graham Young's bedroom, alongside a series of diaries detailing his crimes, was an equally alarming hoard.
His room was festooned with Nazi memorabilia, swastikas, portraits of Hitler, books about Hitler. He swaggered around doing Hitler impersonations with his hair styled like that, the toothbrush with the comb.
For Professor Lou Schlesinger, schizoid obsessive Graham Young's fascination with Nazism offers a revealing insight into his murderous behavior.
What part of the Nazis was he fascinated with? Nazi experimentation. In many of the concentration camps, the physicians were doing experimentation with human subjects. Use of poison gas is another way the Nazis killed people. So a lot of the things that the Nazis did to exterminate people are things that Young himself was very, very fascinated with.
Many of history's most deranged and unfathomable killers have seemingly been influenced by an extreme belief. During the 70s in Santa Cruz, schizophrenic John Frazier slayed a young family, claiming he had been driven by an environmental mission to murder.
He had an epiphany. He thought it was his job to come and save the planet.
He said he was going to go door to door like the Avon lady, said, "Ding dong, you're dead."
In New York, during the mid-70s, serial killer David Berkowitz claimed an altogether different calling had driven him to murder.
He told us the devil told him to kill these women, and the devil communicated to him through the dog.
The irrational beliefs of Richard Trenton Chase led to him being labeled the vampire of Sacramento.
Chase was a paranoid psychotic who was delusional. He had a delusion that his blood was evaporating and he needed to drink the blood of other living things to replenish his own blood.
Richard Chase now was doing things with small animals, killing them, drinking their blood.
In 1977, Chase turned to human prey to satisfy his deranged belief.
He had made an incision down the stomach, and that's an angle, and I found a used yogurt cup, and apparently he had been drinking the blood or doing something with the blood in that cup.
His murders were not, in my view, sexually motivated at all. They were a direct outgrowth of a delusion.
In 1962, in Neasden, London, Nazi-obsessed 14-year-old Graham Young had been arrested following the death of his stepmother and attempted poisoning of his father and sister. For Detective Jackie Sabir, the adolescent's MO is extremely revealing.
He wasn't someone that would physically be able to kill someone in terms of stabbing or strangling, that real up-close personal way of killing someone. With Graham Young, he seemed to take a great pleasure in watching suffering and was able to dehumanize, detach his emotions from what was going on.
Having persuaded his father to cremate his stepmother, Young would only be tried for poisoning his other family members and school friend Chris Williams.
He was sent to the hospital for the criminally insane, Broadmoor in Berkshire.
Having testified in court, former friend Clive Krieger was left with mixed feelings.
My reaction was one of relief, really. both for my own safety and security and my family, but I was concerned what would happen when he came out. You know, we used to get milk delivered outside in those days with a little metal cap on. He could have injected something into the milk bottles. I was concerned.
Aged just 14, the youngest patient since 1885, soon settled into his new life. For Graham Young, it was business as usual.
When he was in Broadmoor, he was still reading books on toxology. So everyone was on their toes around Graham. You know, the staff, the inmates, anyone who come into contact with him.
And the fanatical poisoner was already planning the next phase of his lifelong murderous experiment. In 1962, 14-year-old Londoner Graham Young was being treated in Broadmoor Psychiatric Hospital, having poisoned his family and a close school friend. Although he was the institution's youngest patient, his sinister reputation preceded him.
Young was regarded by his fellow patients a bit warily, not least because he still went around showing off his knowledge of toxicology and poisons.
Imprisoned with Graham Young in later life, Bobby Cummins recalls a sinister character.
There was an aura about him that was sort of in a different world. You know, there was no link with humanity with him. He was like a dead man walking. There was no emotion, there was nothing there.
But serial poisoner Graham Young was keeping a close eye on his fellow patients.
He must have loved it going to Broadmoor, because what he had there was all these lab rats in a closed environment.
One patient mysteriously died of apparent cyanide poisoning.
Young claimed that he himself had extracted the cyanide from laurel bushes in the Broadmoor garden.
He could get the most innocent ingredients and turn them into a lethal cocktail of poison.
Despite his fellow patients keeping him at arm's length, teenage Graham Young was making a different impression on Broadmoor's staff.
His chief psychiatrist looked on the boy with great interest and hoped that he would make a full recovery.
He would have assessed them while they were trying to assess him. And my thoughts were they did not anticipate him being as smart as that.
In 1971, a seemingly reformed Graham Young was released back into the community. After a training period of 3 months, junior storeman Graham Young joined Hadland's photographic factory in Bovingdon. His new colleagues were unaware of his murderous identity.
We were told he was a trainee chemist who didn't pass his exams, so he's going through a retraining. And so fine, he was allowed to, you know, live and let live.
But Graham Young's focus was on death. Throughout the summer of '71, he slipped poison into his colleague's tea. Tragically, storeman Bob Eagle had lost his life, and more employees were falling ill. At a later date, Detective Brendan Hayden would see the terrible toll on the victims firsthand.
I was asked to go and interview Jethro Batt, who at this stage was in hospital. He'd lost an awful lot of his hair. He told me the pain was so excruciating. And one of the worst things he said were the hallucinations he was having. He saw himself in a World War trench, I remember him telling me, with bayonets coming down on him. He told me if he'd had a shotgun, he'd have shot himself.
Jethro Batt would eventually recover from his horrific ordeal. His suffering had been down to Graham Young's most lethal chemical. Thallium had replaced antimony as his poison of choice.
Comparing antimony with thallium, is thallium a more potent poison?
Yes, this is roughly about 10 times more toxic in general than antimony. You absorb more, which would explain why there's a difference in lethal dose.
So once it has been dissolved and it's put in a cup of tea, would you be able to taste it?
Well, the other thing about thallium in comparison with antimony is that it's practically tasteless.
How much thallium would you need to ingest then for it to be fatal?
As little as 1/10 of a gram has been known to kill people.
In the photographic factory in Bovingdon, 2 months had passed since Bob Eagle's death. Senior staff member Fred Biggs was Graham Young's latest target. For Detective Jackie Sabir, Young's written observations of the manager's deterioration give a chilling insight into the killer's obsessional mind.
On the 17th of November, he writes, "The latest news from the hospital is that F is responding to treatment. He is being obstinately difficult. I am most annoyed. He is surviving far too long for my peace of mind." So we've got the clear modus operandi being displayed, but we've also got his response. He expected Fred to die very quickly. It's almost like this is an experiment and this isn't working properly.
Fred Biggs would eventually die in November 1971, having ingested over 100 grams of thallium. Both he and other murder victim Bob Eagle had got on well with their junior colleague, Graham Young.
Bob and Fred were both lovely people. I mean, they really were. And I can imagine them being very encouraging to Graham as they saw it as a protege who they were training effectively. And that's part of the obscenity of the whole thing, really.
Everyone was nice to him. He just again chose them because they were available.
For Professor Lou Schlesinger, Graham Young's apparently motiveless murders were purely a byproduct of his obsessive mission in life.
He wanted to see how poison would affect people. This fascinated him. He was obsessed with this. Young is a schizoid individual who didn't have really much interpersonal connectedness with other people. And he really didn't care if the person died. They were guinea pigs, basically, to him.
Like Graham Young, some of history's most disturbed killers have simply viewed their victims as a means to an end. In the early 1970s, in Santa Cruz, no one was safe from Herbert Mullin and his delusional quest to save the planet.
The voices told him that he was, one of the chosen people, and that it was God's plan that people had to be sacrificed.
He was going to prevent cataclysmic earthquakes by killing people.
He killed women, he killed wealthy people, homeless people. He's responding to psychotic symptoms, hallucinations and delusions, and it was just to kill. So his victim selection was basically random.
I was a good Catholic. I said my prayers every day. Between October 13th, 1972 and February 13th, 1973, I did in fact murder 13 people.
There was a lot of material about the 12 apostles plus one, clearly implying that he was the 13th disciple of God.
It wasn't power and control. He wasn't a psychopath. He was extremely mentally ill. He's a very, very sick guy and remains very sick today.
In 1971, in Bovingdon, Hertfordshire, a second employee at a photographic lab had lost his life at the hand of schizoid obsessive Graham Young's teacup poisoning. Despite his odd character, no one suspected the young storeman.
You'd have probably looked at him and thought, harmless, sort of dopey person, quiet, no problem at all. Make the tea, Graham. But he was a very, very dangerous human being.
But as authorities struggled to find a cause for the deaths, Graham Young was about to expose himself as a killer in an extraordinary display that would dumbfound all around him. In 1971, in Bovingdon, Hertfordshire, junior storeman Graham Young had been poisoning his colleagues in a photographic lab. As a second man lost his life, police were struggling to find a cause. 23-year-old chemistry genius Young had covered his tracks, but his misguided ego was about to get the better of him.
The company's doctor has visited the staff here to sort of
Yeah.
brief them and talk to them. Something unusual happened, I believe, during that briefing?
A member of staff, i.e. Graham Young,
Yeah.
started asking the doctor these questions that the doctor thought was very suspicious.
Graham Young piped up and said, well, do you not think the symptoms would demonstrate that there's something more serious here? Then quoting a whole series of technical terms that would match poisoning.
He wants to be in control of the situation generally, to the point where he doesn't realise he's giving himself away, which of course he was.
Then we got the phone call.
Former Detective Constable Mick Grinstead was sent to search Graham Young's bedsit in nearby Hemel Hempstead.
I had to come up in the street, go to the flat.
Yeah.
It was about 10 or 11 o'clock at night, I think.
Yeah.
The night was terrible. It was raining, windy,
Yeah.
black.
So what did you actually find?
Hanging in front of the wardrobe was a corduroy jacket. We got the top pocket, and there's a file, a glass file, with a cork in it, with something in it.
Described years earlier by a teenage Young as his friend, the dose of poison now had an ominous role.
It turned out to be thallium. And according to Young, subsequently, that was his, what he called his exit dose, should he be arrested or discovered or whatever.
But as the search of the bedsit continued, other evidence would reveal an even darker side to Graham Young.
And there was a writing pad. Looking through that, that was when the nerves come on and started twangling, I think.
There were some drawings, ghoulish drawings in black ink of people. I remember some big finger pointing into a grave, a tombstone.
And Graham Young had also continued his teenage obsession, meticulously recording observations of his poisoning.
And there was my diary, but it had things like, went to the hospital to see Bob, took a bottle of brandy to make sure he didn't wake up.
On reading it and the accounts that were in there, how did that make you feel?
I suppose really it was eureka,
Mm.
you know.
Is that
We've got it.
him?
Yeah.
Got
yeah.
him moment.
As the evidence stacked up, Graham Young was taken into custody. 8 months later, in July 1972, he would deny all charges in court. As a reporter, Anthony Holden attended the trial.
So I sat eyes on him for the first time across the courtroom, and it was a pretty chilling sight. He was the only witness in his own defence.
As the disturbed defendant faced up to his own damning diary notes, Graham Young devised a tall tale to talk his way out of his crimes at the photo lab.
He made out that this poisoner's diary was a novel he was writing to try and explain the events at this factory.
But a letter written by Young to Anthony Holden was completely at odds with his impassioned defence.
He sent me a note across the courtroom via his solicitor saying, I want you to get me into the Chamber of Horrors in Madame Tussauds. I want to go down in history as a famous poisoner.
Although it appeared Graham Young yearned for fame, forensic psychologist Lou Schlesinger believes his extraordinary letter is purely an indication of his haphazard mental state.
I think he said it to the reporter in sort of a flippant way, but really, I don't think Young cared how anybody saw him. A schizoid individual is very different. He lived in his own world. He was just interested in how poisons affect people.
Many disturbed killers who have been driven by a mindless mission have displayed unpredictable behavior in court. Like Graham Young, mentally ill Herbert Mullin took to the stand.
He basically gave us all a lecture.
I felt that my family were sort of playing a killjoy sadistic game on my life, on my mind.
Schizophrenic killer John Frazier altered his appearance to get his message across.
The entire half of his head and face was shaved. And he would sit at the table and kind of turn one way and show the audience that perspective, and he would turn the other way and show a different person.
You can interpret his behavior as trying to represent a split personality, good versus evil, and so on. I would not interpret it that way. I would just say it was a stunt. You could reach the same conclusion without him shaving his head off. Just look at what he did.
In July 1972, Graham Young was found guilty of 2 murders and 2 attempted murders. Despite his severe psychological issues, he pleaded not to be returned to a mental institution.
He said, I do not want to go back to Broadmoor. And so he was sentenced to life's imprisonment in a conventional prison.
Bobby Cummins spent time with Graham Young in Parkhurst. Despite the fact it housed Britain's most violent killers, Young would be feared the most.
The joke went round the neck that all the weirdos went to the Vicar's tea party except Graham. You know, and that's really saying how bad this guy was. Prisoners, if they ever heard that he went near a kitchen, no one would eat that day.
Graham Young died of heart failure in 1990. In the wake of his death, many have analysed his seemingly mindless murders. For Detective Jackie Sabir, his irrational desire to be recognised was all-consuming.
There's every possibility that Graham Young actually might have got away with what he did. In putting his hand up at that meeting with the doctor, he was worried that people hadn't noticed what he had done. He wanted to draw attention to his master plan.
If you look back, there's the early days in the school with the books he was reading and his ambition to be known as a famous poisoner. He wanted to be the top one.
Graham Young joins a class of killer who seemingly possess scarily bent minds, from whom no one is safe.
They don't care about other people and how other people view them. The types of murders that we're talking about are extraordinary murders. Traditional law enforcement approaches to investigation, motive, method, opportunity, that goes out the window because it's very, very different in those cases.
With serial killers, you mostly find that it's rape, it's anger, it's racial. With Graham Young, he didn't have none of those hatreds. To him, he just wanted to see how long it took to kill you.